Level 1. Counter Kid. You're 19, working the counter at Del Rey's, pawn on a Tuesday. Afternoon that smells like WD-40 and other people's regrets. Minimum wage, a stool that wobbles on the left side, and a glass case full of things people traded for rent money. Bail money, grocery money. Your job is simple. Lowball everything that comes through the door. Del Rey's rule, not yours. Sentiment don't pay the power. Bill, he says every single morning, like he invented the phrase. You learn fast that the counter is a confessional. People don't just bring items, they bring stories. And they tell them whether you ask or not. A woman brings in a pearl necklace. Her mother left her and spends 11 minutes explaining why she doesn't need it anymore before she hands it over. A man brings in 3 gold rings on a Wednesday and comes back for 2 of them on Friday, never explains anything at all. You learn to read people the way other kids your age learn to read menus, fast, automatic, deciding before you're even conscious of deciding. 3 months in, a man walks through the door at 4:47 p.m. 13 minutes before close, he's wearing a work jacket with a name tag you don't catch, holding a watch in both hands the way people hold things they're still deciding. Whether to let go of. A Seiko, not rare, not expensive. Blue dial, scratched crystal, second hand that stutters on the 12. He tells you it was his father's and his father's father's, and he needs $200 for his daughter's hospital copay, and he'll be back for it next week. You give him the $200 out of your own drawer because the loan Del Rey would have offered was $60. You don't tell Del Rey. You put the watch in your own jacket pocket and you bring it home, set it on your nightstand, and the stuttering second hand ticks you to sleep. He doesn't come back the next week. He doesn't come back at all. You still have the watch. You don't know yet that you'll still have it in 25 years. You don't know yet that the man with the work jacket will come back eventually, not for the watch, but for a reason you can't predict from either side of this Level 2, floor manager. 2 years in, Del Rey promotes you not because you're good at buying low. You're actually the worst at that. Softest hammer in the shop, but because you never once got played. Every fake gold chain, every switched out stone, every altered serial number that walked through the door, walked back out without a ticket. Del Rey doesn't know how you do it. You don't tell him. You just learn the counter. You learn that the story a person tells and the item they're holding almost never match. And when they don't, something's wrong. Now you manage 3 other counter staff, which means you spend most of your time untangling mistakes. A piece bought at twice its value because a kid felt bad for the seller. A loan given on a serial number that turns out to be a ghost. You start keeping a notebook, not of prices, of people. What they brought in, what they said, whether they came back. Patterns. The notebook fills faster than you expect. You realize something that Del Rey has never figured out in 30 years. The most valuable thing in a pawn shop is not what's in the case. It's who comes through the door and why. A pawn shop is the most honest market on earth. People only trade their irreplaceable things when they absolutely have to. That tells you something about the economy that no news channel does. You start knowing a recession is coming 3 months before the analysts do, just by watching what quality of items start showing up on the counter. Del Rey thinks you're lucky. You're just paying attention. Every night you go home and you check the watch. The second hand still stutters on the 12. You've taken it to 2 watchmakers. Neither could fix it. You stopped trying. Some things are not broken. They just move differently. Level 3, first shop. You're 26 and you borrow $18,000 from your uncle and your mother's savings account, and you sign a lease on a 900 square foot space in a strip mall between a tax prep place and a shoe repair shop. Everything smells like carpet glue for the first month. You build the display cases yourself from hardware store glass and particle board, and 2 of them are slightly crooked, and you never fix them because by the time you have the money to, you've stopped noticing. You name it after nothing, just your last name and the word exchange, because pawn makes people feel judged walking through the door. And you already figured out that the first barrier between a customer and their money is their own pride. You buy $2,000 inventory at a liquidation sale and sort it yourself on the floor of the shop at midnight. This is the part nobody films, the unsexy part. Sorting through 200 items on a cold floor, cataloging each one, pricing each one, building a case out of other people's abandoned things and calling it a business. Week 1, you make $340. Week 2, $890. Week 3, someone walks in with a guitar that turns out to be a pre-CBS Fender Stratocaster and a beat-up case, asking for $150. You give him $150 because that's what he asked for, and you're not Del Rey. You sell it 6 days later for $2,800 to a man who drove 4 hours after seeing it on your newly made website, which you taught yourself to build from a YouTube tutorial at 2 a.m. The $2,650 profit from that one guitar pays your rent for 3 months and teaches you the one rule that will define the next 20 years. The people who walk through your door almost never know what they're carrying. Your job is not to underpay them for their ignorance. Your job is to know what it's worth and find it the home it deserves. That distinction between exploitation and expertise is the line you decide to build your whole business on. Del Rey calls it naive. You Level 4, multi-location operator. 4 shops now in 4 different neighborhoods, and each one teaches you something the others can't. The downtown location gets jewelry and watches, divorce, settlements, estate cleanouts, men who gambled and women who left. The South Side shop gets tools and electronics, men between jobs, contractors hit by slow seasons, a different kind of desperation, more practical, less personal. The university shop gets instruments and laptops and camera gear, sadder kind of item, the tools of abandoned dreams, kids who came to school for something and left it behind. The 4th location, near the hospital, gets you. You didn't plan it there. A commercial lease opened up and you took it. But every week something comes through that door that makes you set it aside under the counter and not put a ticket on it. A wedding ring from a man who waited 3 days after his wife's diagnosis before he came in. A child's bicycle a father brings in on a Thursday morning with a face that closes. A door in itself when you ask if everything's okay. You start a separate cabinet under the counter of the hospital shop. Not for sale. No tickets. Just items you can't price because pricing them would be the wrong thing to do. Your accountant calls it a liability. You call it the only part of the business that makes you want to come in on Monday. The watch lives on the cabinet, not for sale, never for sale. A regional business magazine runs a small feature on the 4-shop operation and calls you the ethical pawnbroker, which you find both flattering and slightly insulting, like being called the honest politician. It gets you 3 interview requests and 1 letter from a national franchise operation asking if you'd consider a buyout. You read the letter once and file it under Level 5, estate auction specialist. The jump happens the way most real jumps do, through a door you didn't go looking for. A lawyer calls. An estate. No living heirs. A 3-bedroom house in the suburbs full of 60 years of accumulated life. And the executor needs someone who can value, catalog, and liquidate the entire contents in 30 days. You take the job because you need the cash and you figure your experience is enough. You walk into that house on a Monday morning and spend the first hour just standing in the living room not touching anything. 60 years of a person's life, organized by someone who clearly believed everything they owned would outlive them. It's the saddest and most beautiful room you've ever stood in. You catalog 847 items in 12 days. Item 614 is a small oil painting in a back bedroom. No signature, dark with old varnish, depicting a harbor scene. You almost price it at $200 for the auction. Something stops you. You photograph it and send it to a contact at a regional auction house. She calls you back in 4 hours, voice slightly tighter than normal. The painting is attributed to a listed American artist, early 20th century. Auction estimate, $40,000 to $60,000. You hold the auction. It sells for $74,000. Since there are no heirs, the money goes to a charitable trust, but your 15% commission on the full estate. Sale is the largest single check you've ever deposited. More importantly, you just realize that your real skill is not buying and selling. It's seeing. You can walk into a room full of things and find the one item that shouldn't be there, the one thing priced wrong, the one story that doesn't match the object. That skill is worth more than 4 pawn shops. You start taking estate contracts exclusively. Within 2 years, you are the most called number in 4 counties when someone dies and leaves behind a house nobody knows what to do. Level 7. national acquisitions, and the television deal. The documentary runs 6 episodes on a streaming platform and gets renewed for 3 more before the first season ends. It is not a show about you, it's a show about the objects, about what things carry, about the archaeology of ordinary life. You are the narrator and the through line, not the star. That distinction is intentional, and it's also the reason people trust it. Viewers don't want to watch a rich man show off what he knows. They want to watch someone who genuinely loves the work do the work. The show generates something none of your previous businesses did: a national inbound pipeline. People contact the production company about objects they've held onto for years, things their grandparents left, things they found in walls, things that came with a house. You spend 6 months a year traveling, a farmhouse in Ohio with a wall of Depression-era photographs that turn out to be a minor but complete archive. A storage unit in Arizona, inherited sight unseen, that contains the working papers of a mid-century aerospace engineer. A beach house in Florida where someone wallpapered an entire room with vintage maps, the kind that are now worth more than the house. Every object has a story. Your job, your actual, evolved job, is to find the one true story inside the false ones people have been telling themselves about what they own. A major auction house approaches you about a partnership, not a buyout, a co-branded operation. Your authentication credibility plus their global sales network. You negotiate for 4 months. You keep one condition non-negotiable: the 4 original shops stay open, run the same way, serving the same neighborhoods. They almost walk. They don't. Level 8. The empire and the weight of it. You are now the kind of person that other people introduce as "you've probably heard of him," which is a strange thing to become when you started on a wobbling stool behind a scratched glass counter. The business at this level is less about objects and more about systems: the authentication pipeline, the estate acquisition network, the auction partnership, the television operation, the original retail chain. You have 61 employees across 4 states. You have a general counsel and an operations director and a logistics manager and a PR firm you hired because a single misattributed piece, painting your team authenticated as genuine that turned out to be a sophisticated forgery, became a news story that threatened to undo everything you'd built on credibility. The forgery case is the hardest year. You don't sleep well for 8 months. Priya finds the error. Spectral analysis anomaly she'd flagged but been overruled on by your own process in the rush of a large estate. You retract the authentication publicly, refund the buyer in full, and add a second sign-off requirement to every assessment. The industry watches to see if it kills you. It doesn't. It makes you the most trusted name in the field because you were the one who corrected it publicly and paid the cost. Trust, it turns out, is not built in the moments when everything goes right. It's built in the moment when something goes wrong and you don't hide. The watch is in your office now, on your desk. Not in a case, not on a stand, just there, beside your keyboard. Some mornings, you pick it up before you start working, and you hold it for a minute. Not for sentiment, or you tell yourself it's not, but because it reminds you what the counter looked like from the other side. Every person who ever handed you something valuable across a glass case was on the wrong side of something. You have never forgotten that, even from Level 9. You have been in this business long enough that the business has become part of the city's story. The 4 original shops still open, still in the same neighborhoods, run now by managers who've been there a decade, still not called pawn shops on the signage. You've authenticated items from museums in 3 countries. You've testified in 7 court cases. You've appeared on the cover of a trade magazine that called you the conscience of the secondary market, which is a phrase you find both accurate and mildly embarrassing. The television show is in its 5th season. Your original 4 shops are the only ones in the network that still do manual price tags, handwriting, because you never changed the policy. And somehow it's become the thing people mention most in reviews, that it feels like a real place, that it feels like someone cares what they're selling. A man walks into the downtown shop on a Thursday afternoon, 14 minutes before close. He's older than you expected him to be. Gray at the temples, same work jacket, different name tag. Retired now, apparently. He asks at the counter for the manager. They call you. He recognizes you immediately, which surprises you. He says he's been trying to find the watch for 6 years. He tracked down 3 other shops, followed the trail backward through records, and eventually found the original transaction in your old notebook, the one you kept for people, not prices. He tells you his daughter is fine. She had surgery at 9, recovered at 10, graduated high school at 18 and college at 22, and last year she had a daughter of her own. He's a grandfather now. He just wanted the watch back. He wanted his granddaughter to have it someday. You go to your office. You take the watch off the desk. You carry it back to the counter, and you set it down in front of him, on the glass without a word. He looks at it for a long moment, the stuttering second hand, still catching on the 12, still doing the thing the 2 watchmakers couldn't fix, and he picks it up and holds it the same way he held it the first time, 25 years ago, both hands, like something still being decided. He reaches into his jacket for a wallet. You put your hand on. This was never the collateral. He looks at you, the way people look when something costs them more than money to accept. He takes the watch. He doesn't say thank you, which is the most genuine response he could have given. He's at the door when you call after him. What was his name? You ask, your father, whose watch it was. He turns. Same as mine, he says. Same as my grandson's going to be. The door closes. You stand at the counter for a moment, on the side you started on, and the shop is quiet the way a shop is quiet just before close, and there is nothing in the case in front of you that you would trade for what just walked out the door. You've spent 25 years knowing what everything is worth. The only thing you could never price was the thing you were waiting to give back. Some items don't belong in a shop. They belong to the story they came from. Tonight you'll go home, and the nightstand where the watch used to